The waves of the English Channel crashed against the hull of Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel LCVP number 47 as Lieutenant Commander Andrew Higgins watched German officers through his binoculars from a safe distance off the Normandy coast. It was May 1944, exactly 1 month before D-Day, and Higgins was conducting a final reconnaissance mission that would nearly cost him his life. What he couldn't know was that the very vessel beneath his feet, ridiculed by Wehrmacht intelligence as coffins with propellers, would become the instrument of Nazi Germany's doom. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you were enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The German officers on the beach were laughing. Higgins could see them pointing at the distinctive profile of Allied landing craft through their own field glasses, their body language unmistakable even from half a mile offshore. One officer theatrically mimicked the flat-bottomed boat tipping over, sending his companions into fits of laughter. They had no idea they were looking at the weapon that would deliver 150,000 troops to their doorstep in a single day, shattering every assumption they held about amphibious warfare. As Higgins ordered his craft to turn back toward England, a German artillery shell screamed overhead, close enough that he felt the heat of its passage. The enemy had spotted them. But as LCVP-47 accelerated away, demonstrating the very maneuverability the Germans dismissed as impossible, Higgins allowed himself a grim smile. Let them laugh. In 30 days, they would understand exactly what they had underestimated. Andrew Jackson Higgins had never been a man who accepted conventional wisdom. Born in Nebraska in 1886 to Irish immigrant parents, he had grown up with calloused hands and an innate understanding that innovation came not from classrooms but from solving real problems in real conditions. By 1938, when most boat designers were focused on sleek recreational vessels and traditional naval architecture, Higgins was perfecting something the world had never seen: a shallow draft boat that could run up onto a beach, discharge its cargo, and reverse back into deep water. The Eureka boat, as he initially called it, had been designed for the Louisiana oil fields and timber operations where traditional boats simply couldn't navigate. The swamps and bayous of Louisiana demanded vessels that could traverse water measured in inches, not feet. Higgins had built his first prototype in his New Orleans workshop, a sprawling industrial complex along the Industrial Canal that smelled perpetually of sawdust, engine oil, and the Mississippi River's muddy tang. His chief engineer, Frank Anderson, a Swedish immigrant with a talent for mechanical innovation, had been skeptical when Higgins first sketched out the concept on the back of an invoice in 1932. "Andrew, a flat-bottom boat will handle like a bathtub in any kind of chop," Anderson had protested, his thick accent making the warning sound even more dire. "You'll kill someone." But Higgins had a vision that transcended traditional boat design. He understood that the boat's very flatness could be an advantage if properly executed. The key was in the bow, a distinctive spoon-bill design that would allow the craft to climb up onto obstacles rather than crash into them. Combined with a protected propeller in a semi-tunnel stern, the boat could operate in water so shallow that fish would need to swim on their sides. The breakthrough had come during a test run in Lake Pontchartrain in 1935. Higgins had personally piloted the prototype toward shore at full throttle, while Anderson gripped the gunwales and prayed in Swedish. Instead of grounding and stopping dead, the boat had risen up, its bow riding over the sandy bottom, and slid smoothly onto the beach. When Higgins cut the engine and climbed out into ankle-deep water, he turned to Anderson with a grin. "Frank, we just changed warfare." Anderson thought his boss had lost his mind, but Higgins had immediately recognized the military applications. He began corresponding with Marine Corps officers, particularly those who remembered the nightmare of Gallipoli in 1915, where thousands of Allied troops had been slaughtered trying to wade ashore from boats that couldn't reach the beaches. The Marines were planning for potential conflicts in the Pacific, where countless islands would need to be assaulted. They needed exactly what Higgins had built. By 1940, as war consumed Europe, Higgins Industries employed over 200 workers and had attracted the attention of the Navy's Bureau of Ships. However, the reception was far from enthusiastic. Rear Admiral Howard Vickery had visited the New Orleans facility in March of that year, his pressed uniform and formal bearing a stark contrast to Higgins' oil-stained work clothes and unfiltered cigarettes.
"Mr. Higgins, the Navy has been building boats for 150 years, Vickery had said, examining a prototype with barely concealed disdain. "Your design violates nearly every principle of naval architecture. The flat bottom will make it unstable. The exposed bow will catch enemy fire. The capacity is insufficient for serious military operations." Higgins had listened patiently, then responded in his characteristic manner. "Admiral, with all due respect, the Navy has been building boats that can't land on beaches for 150 years. I'm building boats that can. Why don't you let me show you?" What followed was a demonstration that entered military legend. Higgins personally piloted a Eureka boat, now redesignated as the Landing Craft Personnel, Large, or LCPL, through choppy waters off the Louisiana coast. He ran at full speed toward a beach while carrying a full complement of Marines, then executed a perfect beach landing, demonstrating how quickly troops could disembark. The Marines had splashed ashore in seconds, established a defensive perimeter, and watched as Higgins reversed the craft off the beach and executed several more landings in quick succession. Admiral Vickery had been forced to revise his assessment, though his report remained cautious. The Navy ordered an initial batch of 100 craft for testing. It was a start, but Higgins knew the design still had critical flaws. The Marines had to clamber over the sides to disembark, making them vulnerable to enemy fire. What he needed was a ramp. The solution came from an unexpected source. In late 1941, a Marine Corps officer showed Higgins photographs of a Japanese landing craft captured in China. The boat featured a bow ramp that dropped down, allowing troops and light vehicles to disembark quickly while remaining protected until the last moment. Higgins immediately saw the potential and set his engineers to work adapting the concept to his design. The result was the Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel, or LCVP, the boat that would become synonymous with D-Day. At 36 feet long and 10 feet wide, it could carry 36 combat-equipped infantrymen or a jeep and 12 men. The distinctive bow ramp protected by armor plating could drop in seconds. The craft drew only 3 feet of water at the stern and 2 feet forward, allowing it to deposit troops in knee-deep water. Its powerful 250-horsepower gray marine diesel engine could push it to 9 knots fully loaded. But perfecting the design was only half the battle. Production would be the true challenge. By early 1942, with America fully committed to war following Pearl Harbor, the demands on Higgins Industries exploded exponentially. The Navy needed not hundreds, but thousands of landing craft, and they needed them immediately. Higgins faced the daunting task of transforming his regional boat-building operation into the largest landing craft manufacturer in the world. His response was characteristically audacious. Within months, Higgins Industries expanded to 7 separate plants throughout New Orleans, employing over 20,000 workers. The main facility on City Park Avenue became a sprawling industrial complex that operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The sound of rivet guns, welding torches, and diesel engines testing became the constant soundtrack of the neighborhood. What made Higgins' operation unique was his willingness to hire anyone who could do the job, regardless of traditional barriers. In the segregated South of the 1940s, Higgins integrated his workforce, hiring African Americans, women, and disabled workers at a time when most defense plants refused to consider them. His reasoning was purely practical. I need workers, and I don't care who they are as long as they can build boats. Mary Catherine Bordelon was among those who found opportunity at Higgins Industries. A 22-year-old woman from Thibodaux, Louisiana, she had never considered working in a factory until her husband shipped out with the Army to North Africa. The wages at Higgins, 90 cents an hour, were twice what she could earn as a seamstress. More importantly,
The work gave her a direct connection to the war effort. Her first day in February 1943 had been overwhelming. The factory floor stretched the length of 3 football fields, filled with the skeletal frames of landing craft in various stages of completion. The noise was incredible. Hammering, drilling, the screech of metal being cut and formed. The smell of welding and paint made her eyes water. She had been assigned to the riveting crew, partnered with an experienced worker named James Washington, an African-American man in his 40s who had worked in shipyards since he was 15. "Don't be nervous, Miss Mary," Washington had told her on that first day, showing her how to operate the riveting gun properly. "These boats are going to save lives. Every rivet you set might mean the difference between a soldier making it home or not. You remember that, and the work has meaning." Washington had been right. As Mary became proficient at her job, moving from riveting to more complex assembly work, she found purpose that transcended the physical labor. She was part of something larger than herself, contributing directly to winning the war. The factory floor became a community, with workers from different backgrounds united by common purpose. The production process Higgins developed was revolutionary for its time. Rather than building boats one at a time, he created an assembly line system, similar to automobile manufacturing. Prefabricated sections moved from station to station, with specialized teams adding components at each stage. The bow ramp assembly was built separately, then mated to the hull. Engines were installed and tested in a dedicated area. The entire process, from raw materials to completed craft ready for the water, took just 3 weeks. Quality control was obsessive. Every boat had to pass rigorous testing before acceptance by the Navy. Higgins personally instituted a policy that any worker could halt production if they spotted a defect, regardless of rank or position. This empowerment of workers created a culture of accountability and pride that showed in the final product. By mid-1943, Higgins Industries was producing over 700 landing craft per month, more than many observers had thought possible for total wartime production. The boats flowed from the factories to the industrial canal, where they were tested, then loaded onto larger ships for transport to bases around the world. Higgins LCVPs were being used in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and throughout the Pacific campaigns. But the largest order was yet to come. In September 1943, Higgins received a visit from a Navy procurement officer with information so classified that their conversation took place in a guarded office with the windows covered. The officer's message was direct: prepare for an order of unprecedented size. The exact number and delivery dates would follow, but Higgins needed to be ready to triple his output. Higgins didn't need to be told what this meant. The cross-channel invasion of France that everyone knew was coming would require landing craft on a scale never before imagined. If successful, it would be the largest amphibious assault in history, and his boats would be carrying the first waves. He returned to the factory floor that evening and walked among the assembly lines, watching his diverse workforce building the craft that would carry liberation to Europe. Mary Bordelon saw him standing there and was struck by the look on his face, a mixture of pride and solemn responsibility. She understood. These weren't just boats anymore. They were instruments of liberation, tools of freedom, and the means by which tyranny would be confronted on its own territory. While Higgins and his workers prepared an armada in Louisiana, across the Atlantic, German military intelligence was making a series of catastrophic miscalculations about Allied capabilities. These errors would prove decisive when the invasion finally came. Generalmajor Friedrich von Rundstedt, commander of German forces in Western Europe, sat in his headquarters at Saint-Germain-en-Laye, just outside Paris, reviewing intelligence reports on Allied landing craft. It was January 1944, and the German High Command knew an invasion was imminent. They simply disagreed about where, when, and how it would unfold. Von Rundstedt was 68 years old, a Prussian officer of the old school who had commanded armies since World War I.
He had been recalled from retirement by Hitler to oversee the defense of Fortress Europe, and he brought with him both extensive military experience and a rigid adherence to traditional military doctrine. In his view, amphibious warfare was constrained by immutable limitations that would govern the Allied invasion. His chief intelligence officer, Oberst Heinrich Meyer, a sharp-faced man with a talent for analysis but a weakness for confirmation bias, had prepared a comprehensive assessment of Allied landing craft capabilities. Meyer spread photographs and reports across the conference table while von Rundstedt's staff gathered around.
Herr General, our analysis is conclusive, Meyer began, pointing to reconnaissance photographs of landing craft gathered at British ports. The Allies possess primarily three types of landing vessels. The landing craft tank can carry armor, but requires prepared ports or calm waters. The landing ship tank is too large to beach and must use smaller craft for the final approach. And these, he tapped a photograph of an LCVP. These flat-bottomed boats are fundamentally unsuitable for serious military operations. Von Rundstedt studied the image. The craft looked crude, almost primitive compared to German engineering. Explain your assessment, Oberst. Meyer had clearly prepared this presentation carefully. The flat-bottom design makes them highly unstable in any sea state above calm. The English Channel is rarely calm, particularly during spring and early summer. Second, their shallow draft and light construction make them vulnerable to even minor obstacles. Mines, beach obstacles, or natural hazards will sink them easily. Third, the open top provides no protection for troops during approach. And fourth, Meyer paused for emphasis, their capacity is limited to perhaps 30 soldiers. Even if the Allies possess thousands of these craft, the logistical challenge of landing and sustaining an invasion force is insurmountable. The room murmured agreement. Major Klaus Dietrich, an engineer who had helped design German beach defenses, added his own assessment. We've calculated that the Allies would need to land at least 100,000 troops in the first wave to establish a viable beachhead against our fortified positions. These small craft, operating in the Channel's conditions, could not possibly deliver such numbers. Therefore, the Allies must rely primarily on seizing a port facility early in their assault, which significantly limits their landing options. This conclusion had become doctrine within German defensive planning. The Wehrmacht had heavily fortified major ports like Cherbourg, Calais, and Le Havre, assuming these would be primary invasion targets. The beaches themselves, while fortified, were considered secondary concerns. Yes, the Allies might land troops directly on beaches, but without a port for sustained logistics, any beachhead would wither and die. Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel, recently appointed to command Army Group B, responsible for defending the coast, disagreed with this assessment, but even he failed to fully appreciate the scale of what was coming. During an inspection tour of Normandy beaches in March 1944, Rommel stood on the bluffs overlooking what would become Omaha Beach and tried to envision an Allied landing. Rommel was accompanied by Hauptmann Wilhelm Hoffmann, a combat engineer tasked with improving beach defenses. As they surveyed the coastline, Rommel gestured toward the water. "Hoffmann, if you were commanding the invasion, how would you use these small landing craft?" Hoffmann considered the question carefully. He had studied reports of Allied amphibious operations in Sicily and Italy. "Herr Feldmarschall, the craft are useful for initial waves, but their limitations are significant. In the Mediterranean operations, the Allies struggled with coordination, weather delays, and high casualty rates. Here, the conditions are worse. The tide range is extreme, 20 feet between high and low. The currents are treacherous. The weather is unpredictable. I believe they will use the landing craft for diversionary attacks while the main force targets a port." Rommel nodded thoughtfully, but something troubled him. He had fought against Allied forces in North Africa and knew they were capable of surprising innovation. What if we're wrong? What if they have more of these craft than we estimate? What if they've solved the problems we think are unsolvable? "Then we'll face a very difficult day, Herr Feldmarschall," Hoffmann admitted. "But even so, our defensive positions are strong. Any troops landing under fire will suffer enormous casualties, and without port facilities, they cannot sustain a major offensive." This was the fatal assumption underlying German defensive strategy, that logistics would ultimately limit Allied operations even if initial landings succeeded. The Wehrmacht had built elaborate defensive positions, bunkers, machine gun nests, artillery emplacements, and millions of mines and obstacles. But these defenses were designed to delay and attrit attacking forces until German armored reserves could arrive and crush the beachhead. What they failed to appreciate was that American industrial capacity had produced landing craft in numbers that made traditional logistical constraints irrelevant, at least for the critical first days of invasion. In London, Allied intelligence officers monitoring German communications and troop dispositions noted with satisfaction that the Wehrmacht appeared to be preparing for the wrong kind of invasion. Ultra-intercepts, decoded German radio messages, revealed the assumption that the Allies would target ports and that landing craft were a supporting element rather than the primary invasion tool. This misapprehension extended to the highest levels of German command. Adolf Hitler himself, in a conference with his generals in April 1944, dismissed concerns about a major beach landing. "The English Channel is not the Mediterranean," he declared. "The Allies cannot simply sail across and expect to land safely. Their small boats are toys, suitable for raids but not serious military operations. When they come, and they will come, to Calais, where the crossing is shortest, we will drive them back into the sea."
Hitler's strategic intuition told him the invasion would target the Pas-de-Calais region, where the channel was narrowest. This belief was reinforced by Allied deception operations, fake equipment concentrations, false radio traffic, and double agents feeding misleading information.
The scale of preparation was overwhelming. Every day brought new convoys of equipment and troops. Landing craft were being loaded, maintained, and organized into assault waves. The Navy had established a complex system of organization. Landing craft were grouped into waves, waves into serials, serials into groups. Each group had specific assignments, specific beaches, specific timings down to the minute. Ensign Robert Calhoun, at 23 one of the youngest coxswains in the Navy, had been assigned to pilot LCVP 47, the same craft that had conducted reconnaissance off Normandy in May. He'd been trained at the Navy's Amphibious Warfare School in Norfolk, Virginia, where instructors had drilled home the critical importance of beach timing and navigation. Miss the landing zone by even a quarter mile, and troops could end up in the wrong sector, facing obstacles they weren't prepared for. Calhoun's training had been intense. He'd learned to read tide tables, navigate by compass and landmark, maintain his engine under combat conditions, and execute beach landings in virtually any weather. The instructors had shown films from Tarawa, where poor timing and navigation had caused unnecessary casualties. They'd emphasized that a coxswain's job was to deliver his troops to the right place at the right time, regardless of enemy fire. Now, conducting final preparations on LCVP 47, Calhoun went through his checklist with obsessive care. Engine oil levels, fuel, hydraulic fluid for the ramp mechanism, radio equipment, navigation instruments. Every system had to be perfect. His crew of 4, an engineer, a radio man, and 2 seamen, worked alongside him, understanding that attention to detail now could mean the difference between success and disaster. "How many trips you think we'll make?" asked Seaman First Class Michael Brennan, a stocky redhead from Boston who served as the engineer. "As many as it takes," Calhoun replied. "The plan calls for multiple waves. We'll be shuttling between the transport ships and the beach all day, assuming we survive the first run." Brennan grinned nervously. "No pressure, right?" The invasion plan was extraordinarily complex, involving precise coordination between thousands of vessels. The landing craft would be loaded on transport ships, attack personnel attack, or APA vessels that could carry multiple LCVPs. These transport ships would anchor 11 miles offshore in an area designated the transport area.
From there, the landing craft would form up in assembly areas called Piccadilly Circus and other code-named locations, then proceed to the line of departure exactly 5,000 yards from the beach. At a precisely scheduled time, the landing craft would begin their run to shore. The timing was critical because it was synchronized with naval bombardment, aerial bombing, and specialized demolition teams tasked with clearing beach obstacles. Every element had to work perfectly for the invasion to succeed. The landing craft were the thread that tied everything together, the vehicles that transformed men and equipment on ships into combat power on shore. Major General Leonard Garreau, commanding 5th Corps, which would assault Omaha Beach, understood this better than most. Standing in his headquarters near Bristol, studying the enormous maps that covered every wall, he felt the weight of responsibility that came with commanding 34,000 troops in the first wave. Everything depended on getting those men ashore quickly enough to prevent German counterattacks from pushing them back into the sea. His chief of staff, Colonel Benjamin Talley, pointed to the timetable displayed on one wall. "Sir, assuming optimal conditions, the first wave will land at H hour. The second wave follows 5 minutes later, third wave 10 minutes after that. By H plus 90 minutes, we should have the entire 1st Division ashore. By H plus 180, 2nd Division lands. The landing craft will make approximately 4 round trips per craft during the first 6 hours. Garreau studied the numbers. Over 1,400 landing craft assigned to his sector alone. If each made 4 trips carrying 30 men, that means over 168,000 troops could be landed through his beach in the first 6 hours. The mathematics were staggering, but mathematics assumed everything went according to plan. No mechanical failures, no navigation errors, no overwhelming enemy fire that prevented landing craft from reaching shore. "What's our contingency if the initial waves suffer heavy casualties?" Garreau asked. Talley hesitated. "Sir, we push forward regardless. The plan assumes 20 to 30% casualties in the first wave. If losses exceed that, subsequent waves will be landing into a more dangerous situation, but we have no alternative. Once we're committed, we're committed." This was the brutal calculus of amphibious warfare. Once the landing craft were in the water, headed for shore, there was no turning back. The troops couldn't retreat to the ships. They had to go forward, regardless of casualties, regardless of conditions. The landing craft would deliver them to the beach, and after that, they either secured a beachhead or died trying. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Thornton commanded the 2nd Battalion, 116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Division, one of the units slated for the first wave at Omaha Beach. In early May, his battalion had been moved to a sealed marshalling area near Southampton, where troops were confined and final preparations completed. The men knew the invasion was coming soon, they just didn't know when or exactly where. Thornton was 32, a graduate of the Citadel, and had trained his battalion relentlessly for this moment. But as he watched his men conduct final equipment checks, he felt the limitations of training. You could simulate beach landings, teach tactics, drill troops until they executed movements automatically. But you couldn't truly prepare someone for running off a landing craft into enemy fire, trying to cross hundreds of yards of open beach while machine guns and artillery sought to kill them. His operations officer, Captain David Chen, was a Chinese-American officer from San Francisco who had overcome significant prejudice to earn his commission. Chen had a talent for logistics and had been working with the Navy to ensure Thornton's battalion would land in the right sector with the right equipment. The coordination was mind-boggling, not just landing the troops, but ensuring follow-up waves brought the right supplies, ammunition, medical equipment, and support weapons at the right times. "Sir, final manifests are complete," Chen reported, handing Thornton a thick folder of documents. "Each company has been assigned specific landing craft. First wave consists of 6 companies across our sector. Your command boat will be in the third wave, landing at H plus 10. Thornton didn't like being in the third wave. He wanted to land with his first troops, but the plan dictated that battalion commanders establish command posts as quickly as possible, which meant landing early but not in the absolute first wave that would face the heaviest initial fire. It was a compromise between leadership and survival. "What's the spacing between craft?" Thornton asked. 50 yards laterally, waves every 100 yards longitudinally. Total of 80 craft in our sector, landing over a 12-minute period. After initial waves, timing gets compressed. Waves will land every 5 minutes for the first hour. Thornton tried to visualize it. Dozens of landing craft approaching simultaneously, each carrying 35 combat-loaded infantrymen, all trying to land in a relatively small section of beach while under fire. The potential for confusion was enormous. If the naval bombardment hadn't suppressed German defensive positions, if the obstacles weren't cleared, if the landing craft missed their assigned sectors, the whole operation could dissolve into chaos. His operations officer, Captain David Chen, was a Chinese-American officer from San Francisco who had overcome significant prejudice to earn his commission. Chen had a talent for logistics and had been working with the Navy to ensure Thornton's battalion would land in the right sector with the right equipment. The coordination was mind-boggling, not just landing the troops, but ensuring follow-up waves brought the right supplies, ammunition, medical equipment, and support weapons at the right times. "Sir, final manifests are complete," Chen reported, handing Thornton a thick folder of documents. "Each company has been assigned specific landing craft. First wave consists of 6 companies across our sector. Your command boat will be in the third wave, landing at H+10. Thornton didn't like being in the third wave. He wanted to land with his first troops, but the plan dictated that battalion commanders establish command posts as quickly as possible, which meant landing early but not in the absolute first wave that would face the heaviest initial fire. It was a compromise between leadership and survival. "What's the spacing between craft?" Thornton asked. 50 yards laterally, waves every 100 yards longitudinally. Total of 80 craft in our sector, landing over a 12-minute period. After initial waves, timing gets compressed. Waves will land every 5 minutes for the first hour. Thornton tried to visualize it. Dozens of landing craft approaching simultaneously, each carrying 35 combat-loaded infantrymen, all trying to land in a relatively small section of beach while under fire. The potential for confusion was enormous. If the naval bombardment hadn't suppressed German defensive positions, if the obstacles weren't cleared, if the landing craft missed their assigned sectors, the whole operation could dissolve into chaos. His company commanders shared these concerns. Captain Robert Pierce, commanding A Company, had gathered his platoon leaders for a final briefing in their barracks. Pierce was 28, from Virginia, and had the distinction of being one of the few combat veterans in the battalion, having fought in North Africa. "Gentlemen, I'm not going to sugarcoat this," Pierce told his lieutenants. "The Navy will bombard the beach for 40 minutes before we land. The Air Force will bomb it. Destroyer fire will hit it again as we approach. But you cannot assume the Germans will be suppressed. You must assume we are going to hit the beach under fire. When that ramp drops, you get your men off that craft and across the beach as fast as humanly possible. The landing craft is a target. The beach is a kill zone. Your objective is the seawall and beyond." Questions. Lieutenant Morrison, the same officer who had spoken to Sergeant McKenna earlier, raised his hand. "Sir, what if the landing craft can't reach shore? What if obstacles prevent the final approach?" Pierce had considered this scenario. "Then you're going into water deeper than expected. Make sure your men know not to inflate life belts until they're off the craft. Last thing you want is to get stuck in the door of the landing craft because your belt inflated. If you're in deep water, move laterally along the beach until you find shallower approach. Do not try to swim directly to shore with combat load. You'll drown." This was the reality that briefings and maps couldn't fully convey. Each landing craft carried men burdened with 60 to 80 pounds of equipment, weapons, ammunition, rations,
entrenching tools, gas masks, grenades. If they ended up in water over their heads, many would sink like stones. Training emphasized proper belt inflation technique and shedding equipment if necessary, but in the stress of combat, with explosions and bullets everywhere, soldiers often made fatal mistakes.
Private Danny Rodriguez, listening to the briefing, felt his earlier confidence evaporating. He joined the Army filled with patriotic enthusiasm and a desire to prove himself. Training had been tough but manageable. Now, facing the reality of what awaited, he understood that courage and preparation might not be enough. Luck would play an enormous role in who survived the first minutes on the beach. After the briefing, he sought out Sergeant McKenna. "You think we'll make it?" McKenna had been writing a letter to his wife, folding it carefully into an envelope. "Some of us will. Focus on doing your job. Follow orders. Keep moving forward. That's all any of us can do." "What if I freeze up?" McKenna looked at the younger soldier with understanding. "Then you'll die on the beach, and so will the men depending on you. So don't freeze. The training will kick in. Your body knows what to do. Trust it." It was harsh advice, but Rodriguez needed to hear it. In the days ahead, there would be no room for doubt or hesitation. The landing craft would carry them to the beach, and after that, everything depended on the individual decisions of thousands of soldiers all facing the same simple choice: forward or death. Meanwhile, aboard the USS Samuel Chase, one of the transport ships that would carry troops to Omaha Beach, Navy crew members were conducting final preparations on the 12 LCVPs stored on deck. Chief Petty Officer Robert Anderson supervised the work, checking each craft personally. Anderson was 42, old for active duty, but his expertise in small boat operations made him invaluable. Ensign Robert Calhoun gripped the wheel of LCVP-47 as the craft circled in the assembly area, designated Piccadilly Circus. Around him, hundreds of other landing craft bobbed in the rough waters, their engines creating a mechanical symphony that somehow felt both powerful and fragile against the immensity of the ocean. The early morning darkness was lifting, revealing a sight that staggered the imagination: the largest invasion fleet in human history, stretching to every horizon. Through the early morning mist, Calhoun could see the massive warships of the bombardment force hurling shells toward the French coast. The thunder of naval guns rolled across the water like an approaching storm. Overhead, waves of Allied bombers passed toward the beach defenses, their engines a deeper rumble beneath the artillery's percussion. The sheer scale of violence being directed at the Norman coast seemed sufficient to obliterate any defensive position. Inside LCVP-47, Sergeant Thomas McKenna sat wedged between Private Danny Rodriguez and 33 other men from A Company, 116th Infantry Regiment. The craft stank of diesel fuel, salt water, and vomit. Half the men had been seasick during the 11-mile journey from the transport ships. McKenna's stomach churned, but he forced himself to breathe slowly, keeping his breakfast down through sheer willpower. Around him, men checked weapons, adjusted equipment, and maintained the careful silence of soldiers about to enter combat. Lieutenant Morrison stood near the bow ramp, one hand braced against the armored plating, occasionally turning to offer encouraging nods to his men. His face was pale, and McKenna could see the lieutenant's hand trembling slightly. Good, McKenna thought. An officer too stupid to be afraid was more dangerous than the Gervans. 5 minutes to line of departure. McKenna's voice cut through the engine noise and the distant bombardment. Check your equipment. McKenna performed the ritual check he'd done 1,000 times in training. Rifle secure, ammunition pouches fastened, grenades properly attached,
water canteen full, gas mask present, life belt not yet inflated. Everything in order. Everything ready. Except his mind, which kept trying to calculate the odds of survival. The pre-invasion briefings had been brutally honest about expected casualties. 30% in the first wave. Some units might face 50%. The officers had presented these numbers matter-of-factly, as if discussing weather patterns rather than the destruction of human beings. McKenna understood the logic. Sugarcoating the danger served no purpose, but the statistics haunted him. Looking around the landing craft, he tried not to wonder which of these men wouldn't be alive in an hour.
Rodriguez caught his eye and attempted a weak grin. "See you on the seawall, Sarge?" "Damn right you will, Danny. Stick close to me when that ramp drops. We move fast, we move together." The landing craft lurched as Calhoun advanced the throttle, and LCVP-47 joined the line of boats moving toward the line of departure. The invisible boundary 5,000 yards from shore where the final assault would begin. Through the gap between the ramp and the hull, McKenna could glimpse other craft moving in formation, a coordinated armada of liberation racing toward destiny. The naval bombardment reached a crescendo. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers poured shells onto the beach defenses in a display of firepower that seemed capable of scouring the earth clean. Surely, McKenna thought, nothing could survive this. Surely the Germans would be shattered, their bunkers destroyed, their machine guns silenced. He was wrong. At precisely 0630 hours, the first wave of landing craft crossed the line of departure and began their run to shore. Aboard LCVP-47, the men of A Company could now see the beach through the occasional spray of seawater, a line of tan sand backed by bluffs, wreathed in smoke from the bombardment. It looked almost peaceful at this distance. "Lock and load," Morrison shouted. "Safety's off when the ramp drops. Stay low, move fast, and follow your training." The distinctive sound of men chambering rounds and clicking off safety catches filled the craft. McKenna felt the familiar weight of his M1 Garand settle into his shoulder. His hands were steady now. The fear was still there, but beneath it was something else, a kind of calm acceptance. Whatever was going to happen would happen in the next few minutes. All the training, all the preparation, all the planning came down to this: 36 men in a flat-bottom boat rushing toward a fortified beach. The bombardment lifted as the landing craft approached. The sudden relative quiet was more unnerving than the guns. McKenna realized he could hear other sounds now, the engines of hundreds of landing craft, the waves slapping against hulls, and somewhere in the distance, a new sound. Pop, pop, pop. Machine gun fire. "Incoming!" someone shouted, and the world exploded into chaos. The Germans had survived the bombardment. Not all of them, but enough. The beach defenses that Allied intelligence had promised would be destroyed were very much operational. As the landing craft entered the final 1,000 yards of approach, German artillery began finding the range. Waterspouts erupted around LCVP-47 as shells hit the water. A craft to their left took a direct hit, disappearing in a fountain of flame and debris. Calhoun fought to maintain course as shrapnel rattled against the hull. His radio man, crouched beside him, was shouting coordinates into the radio, trying to call in fire support. Machine gun tracers stitched patterns across the water. The landing craft's armor protected against small arms fire, but the concentrated firepower was terrifying. 30 seconds, Calhoun screamed. McKenna pulled Rodriguez close to him and shouted in his ear. "When that ramp drops, we run. Don't stop for anything. You stop, you die. Understand?" Rodriguez nodded, his eyes wide with terror, all his earlier bravado gone. The craft lurched as its bow struck the beach. Not the dry sand they'd hoped for, but a sandbar hundreds of yards from shore. The ramp dropped with a metallic clang, and Morrison stood up to lead his men forward. The lieutenant made it 3 steps before German machine gun fire cut him down. He collapsed backward into the craft, blood spreading across his uniform. "Go! Go! Go!" McKenna bellowed, shoving Rodriguez toward the ramp. The men poured out into chest-deep water. Immediately, the weight of their equipment tried to drag them down. McKenna kept his rifle above his head and pushed forward, his legs pumping against the water's resistance. Around him, men were falling, some from enemy fire,
others simply losing their footing and disappearing beneath the surface, dragged down by their combat loads. A bullet passed so close to McKenna's head that he felt its passage. Another struck the water beside him. He didn't think, didn't look around. He just pushed forward with every ounce of strength, knowing that stopping meant death. Rodriguez was struggling beside him, the water up to his neck. McKenna grabbed the private's collar and hauled him forward, half carrying, half dragging the younger man through the surf. The beach seemed impossibly far away. The water turned red with blood. Bodies floated past them. The air was filled with the sounds of bullets snapping, men screaming, explosions, and the relentless chatter of machine guns.
"Keep moving, Danny. Don't you dare stop." They reached shallow water, then the beach itself. McKenna's legs felt like lead, but he forced them to keep moving. The sand was littered with obstacles, steel hedgehogs, wooden stakes, mines, and bodies. So many bodies. Men from the earlier waves who hadn't made it even this far. "Head for the seawall," McKenna shouted, though he didn't know if Rodriguez could hear him over the din. "The seawall!" They ran, stumbled, crawled across what seemed like miles of open sand. Bullets kicked up fountains of sand around them. An explosion to their right sent both men tumbling. McKenna's ears rang, but he grabbed Rodriguez and kept moving. The German defenders were firing from bunkers and trenches on the bluffs above the beach, their fields of fire designed to turn the beach into a killing ground. And it was working. Somehow, luck, desperation, divine intervention, they reached the seawall, a low stone barrier that offered the first cover they'd found. McKenna pressed himself against it, gasping for breath, and looked around. Rodriguez was beside him, alive but shaking uncontrollably. To their left and right, other survivors were gathering, perhaps 20 men from a company that had started with 200. Behind them, more landing craft were approaching. Calhoun had returned LCVP 47 to the transport ships and was bringing another load of troops. The Navy coxswains were showing extraordinary courage, making trip after trip despite the casualties. But each wave was landing into the same deadly fire, the same obstacles, the same chaos. "We have to move inland," a captain McKenna didn't recognize was shouting. "We can't stay pinned on the beach. Engineers, where are my engineers?" A young lieutenant crawled over. "Sir, we lost most of the demolition teams. The obstacles are still in place." "Then we go around them. Gather your men. We're going up those bluffs." McKenna looked up at the heights above them. Steep slopes covered with barbed wire, mines, and German defensive positions. Men were already trying to climb, and German fire was cutting them down. But the captain was right. Staying on the beach meant certain death. They had to move forward. "Danny, you ready?" McKenna asked. Rodriguez's eyes were glazed with shock, but he nodded. "I'm with you, Sarge." The battle for Omaha Beach raged throughout the morning, transforming the sand and surf into a scene from hell. But slowly, incrementally, the balance began to shift. The sheer weight of men and material being landed, delivered by those mockery-inducing flat-bottom boats, began to tell. Destroyers moved dangerously close to shore, their guns providing direct fire support against German bunkers. Navy demolition teams, many working under fire while partially submerged, began clearing paths through the beach obstacles. And on the beach itself, small groups of soldiers, driven by leaders like Sergeant McKenna, began finding ways up the bluffs. By noon, the first American troops had reached the top of the heights overlooking Omaha Beach. By evening, a tenuous beachhead had been established. The cost had been staggering, over 2,000 American casualties on Omaha Beach alone, but the landing had succeeded. And it succeeded because the landing craft kept coming. Wave after wave, hour after hour. Ensign Calhoun made 6 trips in LCVP 47, each one navigating through obstacles, casualties, and increasingly chaotic conditions. On his 4th trip, his engineer, Seaman Brennan, was hit by shrapnel but refused to leave his post until they delivered their troops. On his 5th trip, they took a casualty aboard, a wounded soldier they evacuated on their return trip.
The Germans, watching from their surviving positions, could not comprehend the scale of what they were witnessing. One Wehrmacht officer, captured later that day, kept repeating, "So many boats. We destroyed so many, but more kept coming. Always more. We couldn't stop them all." This was exactly what German intelligence had failed to predict. The landing craft weren't a limited resource that could be exhausted. American industrial capacity had produced them in such numbers that losses, while tragic, weren't strategically decisive. The Higgins boats and their variants formed an endless conveyor belt, transforming ships offshore into combat power on land with an efficiency that traditional amphibious warfare doctrine said was impossible. By the end of D-Day, over 156,000 Allied troops had been landed across 5 beaches in Normandy. On Omaha Beach alone, the most contested landing site, over 34,000 troops and 3,000 vehicles had come ashore. The landing craft had made multiple trips, maintaining the flow of reinforcements and supplies, even as the battle raged.
3 days after D-Day, Sergeant McKenna sat on the stone wall of a Norman farmhouse, smoking a cigarette and watching landing craft still ferrying supplies from ships to the beach. The immediate battle had moved inland, but the logistical miracle continued. Private Rodriguez sat beside him, his arm bandaged from a shrapnel wound that had earned him a Purple Heart but hadn't taken him out of the fight. "Sarge, you ever think about the guys who built these boats?" Rodriguez asked, gesturing toward the beach where dozens of landing craft were working. McKenna considered the question. "Sometimes. Never thought I'd owe my life to some boat builders in Louisiana, but here we are." Back in New Orleans, Mary Catherine Bordelon was riveting components on another landing craft when news of D-Day reached the factory floor. Work stopped as someone turned up a radio, and thousands of workers listened to the first reports of the invasion. When the announcer described American troops landing from Higgins boats, the factory erupted in cheers. These weren't abstract military vessels anymore. They were instruments of liberation, and everyone in that factory knew they'd helped create them. Andrew Higgins himself, standing on the factory floor that day, felt an overwhelming mixture of pride and sorrow. Pride in what his workers had accomplished, sorrow for the casualties he knew those boats had carried into battle. He thought about the young men who'd ridden his boats to the beaches and the ones who hadn't made it back. "We built them the best boats we could," he told Mary Bordelon later. "I hope it was enough." It was enough. The Higgins boats and other landing craft had accomplished what many German officers believed impossible. They'd delivered an army across the English Channel and landed directly into sustained combat. The mockery had become the means of victory. In the decades after World War II, historians and military analysts recognized the landing craft's decisive role in Allied victory. General Eisenhower himself stated, "Andrew Higgins is the man who won the war for us. If Higgins had not designed and built those LCVPs, we never could have landed over an open beach. The whole strategy of the war would have been different." The numbers tell the story of industrial triumph. Higgins Industries and other manufacturers produced over 23,000 landing craft during the war. These vessels participated in every major amphibious operation, from North Africa to Sicily, from Anzio to Normandy, from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. They revolutionized warfare, making possible operations that previous generations of military planners would have considered impossible. The German officers who laughed at the flat-bottom boats in the spring of 1944 learned a harsh lesson: that innovation often looks crude to conventional minds, that industrial capacity can overcome apparent technical limitations, and that underestimating your enemy's ingenuity is a fatal mistake. Sergeant McKenna survived the war and returned to Baltimore, where he worked as a shipyard foreman. He never forgot the morning of June 6, 1944, or the flat-bottom boat that carried him through hell to reach the beach. Every year on the anniversary of D-Day, he would raise a glass and offer a quiet toast. "To the Higgins boats and the people who built them. They brought us home." Private Rodriguez returned to Los Angeles and became a high school teacher.
spending 40 years educating young people about the war and the importance of the home front contribution. He kept a photograph of LCVP 47 on his classroom wall, using it to illustrate how ordinary people, factory workers, boat designers, young soldiers, could achieve extraordinary things when united by common purpose. Ensign Calhoun remained in the Navy and eventually commanded a destroyer. But he never forgot his time as a coxswain, piloting landing craft through German fire. In his retirement, he wrote a memoir titled The View from the Helm, dedicating it to the thousands of coxswains who steered through hell to deliver freedom. And Mary Catherine Bordelon. She continued working at Higgins Industries until the war ended, then used her wages to attend business school. She eventually opened her own manufacturing company in Louisiana, employing many of her former Higgins co-workers. On the wall of her office hung a photograph of a Higgins boat hitting the beach at Normandy. Beneath it, a simple plaque. "We built these. We helped win the war." The mockery had become a monument. The crude-looking flat-bottom boats that German intelligence dismissed had delivered victory to the shores of Europe. They proved that innovation, industrial capacity, and the courage of ordinary people could overcome any obstacle, even the Atlantic Wall that Hitler claimed was impregnable.
Today, restored Higgins boats sit in museums, silent testaments to the men and women who built them and the soldiers who rode them to battle. They look exactly as they did in 1944, ungainly, utilitarian, unlikely vessels for changing history. But that appearance deceived then just as it might deceive now. These boats represent one of the most effective military innovations of the 20th century, the product of American ingenuity, industrial might, and the determination to defeat tyranny. The Germans were right about one thing. The Higgins boat didn't look impressive. But as 150,000 Allied troops landed on D-Day proved, it didn't need to look impressive. It needed to work. And work it did, carrying liberation across the water to the shores of occupied Europe one wave at a time, transforming the course of history 36 men at a time. If this story moved you, if you found yourself transported to the decks of those landing craft or standing alongside Mary Catherine Bordelon on the factory floor, please take a moment to like this video and share it with others who appreciate deep, immersive historical storytelling. Creating content of this length and detail, essentially writing and narrating a complete book, requires countless hours of research, writing, and production. Your support through likes, shares, and subscriptions is what makes these epic narratives possible. Subscribe to this channel if you want more stories like this, detailed, engaging, novel-length explorations of history's most fascinating moments. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we release our next story. Whether it's military history, tales of innovation, or stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, we're committed to bringing you the most engaging historical content on YouTube. Share your thoughts in the comments. What surprised you most about this story? Had you known about Andrew Higgins before? Do you have family members who served on D-Day? This community thrives on discussion and shared appreciation for history, so please join the conversation. Thank you for spending these hours with me, for caring about history, and for supporting the kind of long-form, detailed storytelling that dives deep rather than skimming the surface. The story of the Higgins boat reminds us that world-changing innovations often come from unexpected places, that courage takes many forms, and that ordinary people, when united by purpose, can achieve the extraordinary. Until our next story, remember the lessons of D-Day. Never underestimate those who dare to innovate, never forget those who sacrificed, and always remember that freedom's victories are built by countless hands working toward a common goal. See you in the next story. Stay curious, stay engaged, and keep exploring history with us. Subscribe, share, remember.